The field of psychology as a whole has made great strides in determining what mental illnesses are and how they ought to be treated. What remains unsettled, however, is whether or not mental illnesses are located in the mind or in the brain. Take a computer whose screen is flashing intermittently as an example. All would agree that there is some dysfunction that is occurring inside the computer that is preventing it from functioning as it is naturally intended. In order to correct the malfunction, one must either seek to correct the hardware of the computer or the software which tells the hardware of the computer how to function. Both explanations of the problem seem valid. It is just as plausible to surmise that there is something preventing the microscopic keys on the logic on the computer from properly displaying its images as it is to assume that there is some error in your drivers that are installed on the software side. Regardless, where we place the location of dysfunction matters significantly in how we explain dysfunction and treat it. Today, psychiatrists operate under the biopsychosocial model of mental illness, which is guided by the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Under this model, mental illnesses are implied to be located in the person, represent a dysfunction in that person, and harm the processor. In this way, the DSM-5 leans towards an understanding of mental illness that is distinctly mental rather than neurological. For many reasons, which I won't get into in this video, there's a growing frustration with the DSM-5. Eliminativists argue that the DSM-5 is outdated due to its focus on mental symptoms rather than on neurological functions of the brain. The eliminativists argue that since the development of new scientific technologies, we ought to reduce mental illness to neurological dysfunction that can be discovered with brain scans from a lab. Eliminativists will go so far as to say that common diagnoses that exist today, such as depression or schizophrenia, will be replaced entirely with new diagnoses in the coming years. There is some pushback to this growing movement. Matthew Broom and Lisa Bortoloni, in their paper titled In Defense of Psychological Realism, argue that objectivity is possible in spite of making use of mental states to define what mental illness is. Psychological realism holds that for someone who is experiencing delusions, it is perfectly necessary and valid to describe their condition with mental state terms, so we do not reduce their mental state terms to pure neurobiology. The delusional person who wholeheartedly believes in that which is unreal cannot be taken to a lab and have their mental illness discovered on a brain scan. Therefore, neurology cannot dissolve all definitions of mental illness that make use of mental states. Why bother with eliminativism in the first place? Well, once there was a time that mental illnesses included things like drapetomania, a mental illness common in slaves who wished for their own freedom. Demonic possession once fell under the category of mental illness, wherein professionals were specifically trained to treat it and often had success in combating it. Today, all scientists are eliminativists about demonic possession and drapetomania. So why not apply the same view to our current mental illnesses? We do frequently get it wrong and use value judgments rather than objective truths to dictate what is and isn't a mental illness. The strength of the eliminativist's argument would be in its ability to quantify what is qualitative. To better understand both sides of the debate between psychological realism and eliminativism, we might hear a patient story of someone who is diagnosed with a mental disorder, and then see how the location of their mental illness could be interpreted in different ways. What you are about to hear is a summarized patient story from a consumer guide designed to promote education and understanding among anyone who has been touched by mental illness, called Understanding Mental Disorders, Your Guide to DSM-5.
Take Roger, a 71-year-old man who was referred to a psychiatrist by his primary care doctor for symptoms of depression that had not responded to medication. Roger's wife reported that he had begun to change at age 68, about a year after his retirement. He had stopped playing golf and cards, which he had enjoyed for decades. He no longer looked forward to going out of the house, and he refused to socialize. Instead, he sat on the couch all day and watched TV or napped. His wife said he was sleeping about 10 to 13 hours a day, instead of his normal 7 hours. His wife had become worried that retirement had left Roger depressed, and she had mentioned her concerns to their primary care doctor. Their doctor agreed and prescribed an antidepressant. Roger's symptoms did not improve on the medication, and the doctor then referred him for a psychiatric evaluation. Roger had graduated from college with a degree in business, had a successful career as a corporate manager, and retired at age 67. He and his wife had been married for 45 years, said there were no major marital problems, and had 3 children and 4 grandchildren, who were all in good health. Before this, he had been outgoing, energetic, and well organized. Roger had high blood pressure and high cholesterol and was taking medication for these conditions. A medical exam showed he was alert and cooperative and had steady but slow speech. Roger had limited range of emotional expression, denied feeling sad or guilty, but felt he retired too early. He was aware that his wife was concerned and agreed that he had less energy and was less active in the past. He blamed these changes on his retirement. During the exam, Roger could name the year, but not the month or the day of the week for his appointment. He remembered one of the 3 objects in 2 minutes, performed 3 of 5 subtractions correctly, named 4 common objects correctly, and repeated a complex sentence without error. He was able to draw the face of a clock and place the numbers correctly, but he was not able to correctly place the hands at 10 minutes after 2.
Roger was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He had a 3-year history of gradual social withdrawal. He has a family history of depression and a brother and late-life dementia in his mother. The main symptoms were slowness, lack of concern about his decline, and increased sleep. The exam showed problems in memory, concentration in math, as well as trouble with clock drawing. For patients with Alzheimer's, doctors could describe their mental illness as purely in terms of neurology. They could say that the patient's brain has been altered so that its composition of sulci and gyri is off balance. This biological imbalance in the brain is thus preventing neurons from properly communicating with each other, and therefore the patient has a mental illness. A psychological realist might say that this description reduces what is happening in Roger's mind too much. They might argue that Roger's diagnosis required mental state terms. Remember the main symptoms that prompted Roger's wife to bring him to the doctor? Slowness, lack of concern about his decline, etc. Are these symptoms less real than the biological composition of Roger's brain? Where do you fall in this debate? Should mental illnesses be reduced down to a hardware problem? Or do you believe that mental illnesses are best described as software ones? Maybe you fall somewhere in the middle. Regardless, pay attention to where you locate mental illness because it plays a huge factor in the way that mental illnesses are treated.